So, like I said, Hebrews chapter 2, verse 1. It says, and I'm reading out of the NASB, if you guys want to follow longer. I call it the NASB, other people call it NASB, same thing. But it says, for this reason you must pay much close attention to what you have heard, so that you do not drift away from it. I'm going to stop you right there. I know the question on each and every single one of your minds. What are these things that we have heard that we must pay attention to? And these things are found in Hebrews chapter 1. I'm going to turn there right now. And it goes from Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. It said, God, after he had spoken long ago through the fathers and the prophets in many portions and in many ways in the last days, has spoken to us through his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom he also made the world. He is the radiance of the glory of the exact representation of the nature, and upholds all things by the word of his power. When he made purifications for the sin, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty, having become much better than the angels, as he inherited a name more excellent than theirs. So right there, just setting the scene, it's saying, back to chapter 2, the thing that we must keep on the forefront of our mind is that Jesus is higher than anything else. He's higher than the angels. He's higher than creation, because he is the one that made creation. One very important thing here. When he's referring to drift, he's saying we must keep these at the forefront of our mind, because if we look at the original Greek word here, the word drift has the sense of like a boat being next to a dock. You know, the boat will be here 1 second and then kind of come here and then over here. And before you know it, you're like, how did I end up here? I was in the middle of the room. So that's why he's saying we must pay attention to it and keep it on the forefront of our mind, because if it's not, we're just going to drift away little by little, and then we're going to wake up one morning saying, how did I end up so far from God, from Jesus? How did I end up here? So let me just backtrack a little bit. Book of Hebrews, there's many debates about the authorship, who wrote the book of Hebrews. Two important names that come up when we talk about this are Paul and Luke. Paul's name comes up because he had a grasp of the Old Testament. And we see, as we're going to see, whoever wrote this book was very knowledgeable about the Old Testament, knew their traditions, knew about the tabernacle, knew about the priests and how to become a priest and all of that. And Paul was a Pharisee, and he knew all of these things inside and out. Another name that comes up is Luke. As we look at the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, we see it's very detailed, because Luke was a doctor. So he's very good at taking notes, analyzing things, and we also see that in the book of Hebrews. And then the third argument is that they both wrote it. Some people say that Paul wrote it in Hebrew, and then later Luke translated it to Greek. But more important than who wrote it is who they wrote it to and why they wrote it.
Amen.
They wrote it to the Jewish people, and they wrote it for this reason. The Jews at the time some of them were starting to believe in Jesus as the Messiah that was promised to them, but others of them were not, and they were being persecuted, as we see all throughout the book of Romans. And as we see, Paul, before his conversion, he was going up to all these Christians now and persecuting them, because Christianity wasn't a legitimate religion at the time. It was like, if you're filling out an application, Christianity was not on the application over there. Not that they would fill out applications, but they were to fill out applications. So they were being persecuted for that. They're like, what are you thinking? You can't just be making up religions. If I was to say I'm going to worship a cat, people would mock me to a certain degree. They'd be like, what is a cat that you're worshiping a cat? And that's what they were doing at the time. They're like, who's this man that you're worshiping? And the author goes through and explains why that is. So chapter 2, verse 2 says, for the word was spoken through angels and proved unalterable, and every transgression and disobedience received a just penalty. Again, the author had a very good grasp of the Old Testament, and when the readers would have read this at the time, they would have completely understood that when it says the word was first spoken through angels and proved unalterable, that is speaking of when Moses was on Mount Sinai and the Lord gave him the Ten Commandments, and the Lord spoke through him. So the Lord spoke through Moses, and that word was proven unalterable, and they saw that through Jesus Christ. And it says, and disobedience received a just penalty. So Moses received the Ten Commandments, and we know from that the penalty for not keeping the Ten Commandments was death. Verse 3 says, how will we escape it if we neglect so great a salvation? After it was first spoken through the Lord, it was confirmed to us by those who heard. God also testified with them both by signs and wonders, and by various miracles, and by the gifts of the Holy Spirit according to his own will. So like I said, we had all these people claiming they were Christians, and God used these speaking in tongues and healing and different things as an affirmation of them. It wasn't, you don't have to speak in tongues to know that you're believed, because I know a lot of denominations and people say that now. They say when you're filled with the Holy Spirit that you're going to start speaking in tongues, because that's what it says here. But God used that at the time just to affirm them. It wasn't to prove any point. It wasn't God making himself bigger than he is or anything. He was just affirming his people through that. And he testified. So, again, it's just setting the scene for how Jesus is so much better than anything anything else that the Jews had previously worshipped prior to Jesus. And we're going to dive into a lot more details in the chapters to come. So if you go to chapter 3 now, we're going to stop, we're going to go up to chapter 6, and then I'm going to finish up next week. And I know you're probably thinking 6 chapters, it's not that bad. We're just doing like a brief overview. I promise I won't keep you here too long. Chapter 3 verse 1 says, therefore, holy brethren, partakers of a heavenly calling, consider Jesus the apostle and high priest of our confessions. Now I don't want you to see the word consider and think like, oh, would you consider going to Applebee's with us after church? It's not like that kind of consideration. The word consider here means to understand, to comprehend, to see, to perceive, to look at, to gaze, to observe, or to spy out. So it's a much more than just, hey, would you consider doing this with me? It's really evaluate it and look at what you're getting yourself into before, and consider him the apostle and high priest of our confessions. Not one of, not just the possibility, but he is the. Goes on to say, he was faithful to him who appointed him, as Moses was also in all his house. Now, again, to them, Moses was a big deal. Moses was the one that led them out of Egypt. Moses was the one that gave them the Ten Commandments. Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, so to them, Moses was it. So for him to say, what he goes on to say, for he has been counted more worthy of more glory than Moses, by just so much that the builder of the house has more honor than the house itself. I can take out this iPhone 6. I can